Hello, friends. So, over the last month, we've kind of been covering some heavy topics. We spent an entire month looking at the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary and connecting them with the mystical theology of some of our greatest saints. And we covered some heavy topics. We covered redemptive suffering, we covered crucifixion and martyrdom. And it's still one of my favorite series that I've done, and I hope you check it out. But then following that, we did a tribute to Pope Francis, so we've had a lot of heavy stuff lately. So I figured it's the week of the conclave, so let's have some fun and let's do a series on strange popes. All in all, this series will be covering 4 popes. The first today will be Pope Sylvester II, who is alleged to be a sorcerer. So I will be sharing these first 2 popes live on all of my platforms. However, the remainder of the series will be on my Patreon. If you're unfamiliar with my Patreon, you have access to over 600 pieces of bonus content, bonus episodes, articles, downloadable PDFs, and much more. There are even tiers where we exchange spiritual letters to each other, and there's even a tier where you get a gift every month. So please consider supporting my work through Patreon, and if you cannot, please consider supporting my work through liking and subscribing and sharing with a friend. But without further ado, let's talk about one of the strangest popes in church history, a man that was alleged to be a sorcerer, Pope Sylvester II. They say that he could hear the stars, that he built machines that spoke with voices not of this world, and that he knew long before the cardinals crowned him exactly when and where he would die. His name was Gerbert of Orleac, but history remembers him as Pope Sylvester II, mathematician, scientist, engineer, and according to legend, a sorcerer in the chair of St. Peter. Beneath the Lateran Palace, buried under Rome's sacred stone, he built it. Not merely forged, but summoned into being. This thing was a mechanical head made out of bronze, cast in secrecy, sealed with blood and ancient rites. They say Sylvester bound a spirit to this bronze head. Not a spirit of an angel, not the spirit of a saint, but something much older, much darker, and something demonic. And this bronze head, this fortune-telling head, it spoke to Sylvester, but only yes or no. But the answers never lied. And on a storm-lit night, as wind howled through the colonnades, Pope Sylvester descended alone to ask the head a question that no man should ask. So there he was, standing alone in the chamber, the candlelight casting trembling shadows across the bronze face in front of him. And he stared into those lifeless eyes, polished and empty. And from within the hollow skull came a low mechanical hum, and it was a sound that almost seemed like breathing, like something alive that was pretending to sleep. And the machine head breathed in, breathed out, breathed in, breathed out. Sylvester did not flinch, and then he began to ask his questions. "Will I reign long?" Sylvester asked. "Yes," the head replied. "Will the church remember me kindly?" "No," the head replied. Sylvester crossed his arms and furrowed his brow and nodded silently. "Will I see the East reclaimed? Will Rome rise to her glory again?" "No. No." A long silence. Sylvester breathes in slowly and deliberately. And then he asks the question, "Will I die in Jerusalem?" The ticking slows, the hum it flickers, in the room it holds its breath. Finally, an answer spills out from the jaws of this demon machine. Yes. They say Sylvester stepped back like something had cut through him, but then a devilish grin appeared across his face. Because Sylvester thought he could cheat the answer. But prophecy does not care about your maps, and the devil, he reads the fine print every time. This is the legend of the Pope who spoke to machines, whispered to stars, and may have made a deal to rule the world. This is not the real story of Pope Sylvester, but it's the legend that has persisted over time. This is the Sorcerer Pope Sylvester, and this is St. Anthony's tongue. Peace be with you and with your spirit. Welcome to another episode of St. Anthony's Tongue. I am your host, W. So we are going to kick off our series on strange popes with a pope that is not very familiar to people. However, some people are familiar with his legend, which states he was a sorcerer, a conjurer, a necromancer, and that is Sylvester II. So by the way, I'm going to be looking over here at my laptop more often than usual. Usually we're talking about mystical theology, and usually I can just riff on that for hours, but I had to do some research for this one. Also, this was going to be just an audio episode or an article, but my Patreon supporters voted that this be a video series. So here we are. I am your humble servant, Patreon supporters. So rather than just jumping in to Sylvester's life, I want to rather jump into his legend. So first, let's not talk about who the real Sylvester was. Let's talk about how he is described in his many legends. Let's begin. In the highlands of Auvergne, France, where mist clings to forest and bells echo from lonely chapels, a boy named Gerbert of Orléac was born to humble origins. But from the beginning, he was no ordinary child. He learned Latin faster than he learned French. And even at a young age, he would build these devices with levers and pulleys. And people said even then he was a savant, or he was touched by the supernatural. And soon his childhood genius caught the attention of Count Borel of Barcelona, who took him to Spain to get educated, potentially to be a clergyman. And here in Spain was very unique because the European people, the Spanish people, they would rub elbows with the Islamic scholars of the ancient world. And this was no ordinary journey to Spain. Here it said that Gerbert entered a school, and on the face, it kind of masqueraded as a normal school for gifted children. However, it was really a school for the forbidden arts, possibly near Seville. And it was here that Gerbert was educated by magicians who served the devil himself. So, he would study astronomy and arithmetic, but really, he was studying the dark arts as well. And during this time, he fell in love with a Moorish woman, the daughter of his occult teacher. And when his master discovered the affair, Gerbert fled. But before he fled, he stole a grimoire, a book of dark knowledge. In there, his teacher, his master, was searching for him, searching to see where he was hiding, and there he opened up his book and cast a spell to make himself invisible, so he was able to flee away from his teacher and back into the world. So from there, he used the grimoire to do his bidding. It said that he even summoned demon succubus spirits that were essentially his demon girlfriends. And they would do his bidding, but at a price. He then went to Rome and later a monastery of Bobbio, where he concealed his studies and secret mechanical experiments in astrology. In this monastery, it held one of the largest libraries in Italy, and it was there that Gerbert allegedly built a brazen head. These are these massive bronze heads that you see a lot in ancient lore. But this head, it was not just a machine. It wasn't just this mechanical thing in which he used steam and levers so it could open and close its mouth. This brazen head had a demon within it. He summoned a demon and put it into the head so he could tell the future. It was capable of speech, but it could only answer yes or no, but it always answered truthfully. And according to the legend, through divination, through asking questions, the head told him, yes, you will become pope, but you will die while saying Mass in Jerusalem. Gerbert's rise was astonishing, even in the factual aspects of his story, but in the legend as well. He became abbot of Bobbio, then the Archbishop of Reims, and then he went on to tutor the Emperor Otto II and was a close advisor. So with imperial backing and imperial support, he would become Pope Sylvester. However, this would occur in the year 999, a year of fear, right? Just like we had 1999 here, and everyone was concerned about what would happen, or the Mayan calendar prophecy a few years ago, or over a decade ago. The same thing happened. Everyone was concerned about this year, and now we have a pope that allegedly dabbles in the dark arts. What might happen? And the fact that he was pope during this year, just before the first millennium, led people to trust him even less. As pope, Sylvester reformed the church's education system. He promoted classical learning and supported the Christianization of Eastern Europe. He introduced the abacus, the armillary sphere, and possibly even mechanical clocks to the West. But to his enemies, these marvels were not natural. How did this man gain such knowledge? And how are these things even possible? This must be the workings of a man in league with hell. Stories began to circulate that Sylvester II practiced necromancy in the Vatican. He would conjure spirits beneath the Lateran Palace. He would consult with stars before making decisions and communed with the devil as well as his demonic talking head machine. It was done to secure the papal throne, and now it is being done to further his potential evil deeds behind the chair of St. Peter. His enemies, especially in the church, they fed these rumors. A document attributed to Cardinal Benno accused Sylvester II of sorcery centuries after his death. Meanwhile, legends also started to form, claiming that he traveled by night on a mechanical horse, possibly a reference to early automation or clockwork devices. Someone said he kept demon familiars in iron cages beneath the chambers. Others believed that he was in direct communication with Lucifer, who gave him the power to raise empires and predict deaths. However, despite all of his power, despite all of his influence, he was continually haunted by what that Brazen Head said to him before he was pope. The words kept him up at night. "You will die in Jerusalem." Therefore, Sylvester was clever, though. Sometimes he would even go and ask the Brazen Head, "Will I still die in Jerusalem?" And the head, of course, would reply yes. But Sylvester was smart. This was easy. "I just won't go to Jerusalem," he said. "I can trick the devil. I can outsmart fate." But one day, in the year 1003, he was visiting a church by the name of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, a basilica in Rome, whose name translates to the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. So even though he was in Rome, he was celebrating Mass in a church called the Holy Cross of Jerusalem. And during this Mass, he was struck ill and died. He realized too late that the prophecy referred not to the real Jerusalem, but to this Roman church. He collapsed at the altar. Some say the devil came for his soul on the spot, and that a foul wind swept through the chapel. And according to legend, Sylvester's body was buried in St. John Lateran. But it would not stay quiet. For centuries it was said that his tomb would rattle or even sweat before the death of a pope, that his tongue would not decay, which is a sign of lies and demonic pacts. He would wander the Vatican at night, searching for his lost head or his lost mechanical horse, asking ghosts of scholars questions in forgotten tongues. All right, so that is Sylvester according to legends. Now let's talk about Sylvester according to history, and then after that we're going to get to the roots of those legends, and I think that's going to be the most interesting part of our episode today, so hang in there. But I wanted to take a moment to talk about who really was Pope Sylvester, because we've heard all of these things about brazen heads and pacts with the demons and devils and succubus girlfriends. So who was Sylvester II? So the first part is true. He was born Gerbert of Arliac in Arliac, France. And he was a child prodigy of sorts. He showed a propensity for Latin, mathematics, and mechanics at a very young age. And it's also true that his brilliance caught the attention of an emperor or an emperor's friend who decided he should get education in Spain. And that is true as well. He did join a school near Catalonia in Spain, and this was a time where a lot of Islamic scholars were mixed inside of universities with Christian Catholic scholars. So he got a very unique education, education that involved mathematics and engineering and certain new forms of arithmetic that were not in the West. So he was educated in a very unique way. And as the story says, after that, so there's no proof or evidence that he went to some kind of Hogwarts-esque occultist school. He went to a notable university. And then when graduating, he worked his way up to become an archbishop in Reims, France. And in France, he did a lot of incredible things. He did introduce things like the astrolabe, things like the abacus and more to France. But he also did some unique things. He's actually one of the first people to allegedly create a mechanical clock. Also, he invented a new type of organ that was powered by steam rather than pumping air into it. And it was considered one of the most finest organs in a mechanical masterpiece of the time, which, of course, this would have caught the attention of people who said, oh no, that knowledge is demonic. And during this time, he became a tutor of a very notable Roman emperor, Otto II. And then when Otto II's son became the emperor of Rome, he used his influence to really vie for Gerbert to become pope. So the year 999 comes around, and Gerbert does become Pope Sylvester II. He's the first French pope, and he takes his name Sylvester II because Sylvester I was the pope during the reign of Constantine. So here he is trying to say he wants to spread Christianity and work with emperors, just like Sylvester I worked alongside Constantine. He cleared up a lot of corruption, actually. He opposed simony and other forms of corruption. He advocated for reform of church structure and discipline, and he promoted stronger papal independence from local nobility. And that's kind of interesting because local nobility kind of helped get him to become pope because the emperor was really pushing for it. But when he would become pope, he would say, hey, we kind of need to figure this out. Less involvement from royalty. So here he had a lot of intellectual contributions to the church as the pontiff. He promoted the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. He encouraged the use of tools like the abacus and the armillary sphere. And he also revived classical logic in education in cathedral schools. And he balanced faith with reason. So he did die in 1003. We have no evidence that he died in a church while saying Mass or a church named after Jerusalem. But he very much was misunderstood in his time. But he is still remembered as one of the most learned men of the 10th century. However, what I really want to talk about here is how did this happen? How did this man who was really just a well-educated scholar, who made great contributions, the mechanical clock potentially, and various other tools of education in cathedral schools, how did he become affiliated with talking demonic heads and demonic pacts? So let's talk about it. This next section we will cover how he became seen as a sorcerer. All right, so this is kind of the meat and potatoes of this episode. So how did Sylvester, this brilliant, learned scholar, how did he become associated with brazen heads and sorcery? And there's a lot of ways to answer that. And we're going to go through each step, each legend within his myth, and discuss its origins. But these things were first attributed to Sylvester due to papal politics, which happens quite a lot. So a common political issue in the Middle Ages was when the kings had authority to appoint clergy, to appoint bishops, cardinals, and sometimes even popes. This kind of happened with Sylvester. But many popes, they were not okay with this, obviously. They knew that this kind of minimized their authority and it led to a lot of corruption. And this was called the investiture controversy. And it began around 1076, so Sylvester was still alive, but it really picked up in the early 1100s, so a few years or a decade or so after the death of Sylvester II. But the issue would reach a boiling point with Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV, who was an emperor of Germany. So Henry IV wanted to appoint his own cardinal, so on and so forth. But finally, this Pope, Gregory VII, stood up to Henry. And this led to one of Emperor Henry's closest allies, a man named Cardinal Benno, to write a pamphlet. The pamphlet was called Gesta Romanae Ecclesiae contra Hildebrandium, which is Deeds of the Roman Church against Hildebrand. By the way, Hildebrand was Pope Gregory's real name. I should also add that we're not sure if Cardinal Benno really wrote this. It could have been one of another member of Henry's court who just said it was from Cardinal Benno to try to give it more authority. But either way, this pamphlet said very, very awful things about many popes. And in this pamphlet, it accused many popes of wizardry and sorcery. Not only Gregory VII, but also Pope Leo I and III, Pope Honoris, the third, Boniface VIII, and of course, Sylvester II. So Benno's point here was basically, when you guys pick out popes, they tend to be sorcerers. So let the royalty do it. Now, this isn't factually accurate because Sylvester II was kind of appointed by Emperor Otto II, or third rather. But either way, this pamphlet listed all of these popes as sorcerers and said, this is why you shouldn't be left up to your own devices. But this account was very brief, very, very brief. It kind of just listed a bunch of sorcerer popes, wizard popes. But things really started to pick up about 200 years later with the monk and historian William of Malmesbury in his De Gestis Regnum Angelorum, the Chronicle of the Kings of England. William of Malmesbury, is a very notable chronicler. He's considered one of the greatest English historians, probably second to the Venerable Bede. So around 200 years after Sylvester's death, we see this chronicle, and within it is Sylvester II, and it tells this story. It tells the story of him stealing this occult grimoire from a occultist teacher. We see various deals with demons. We see the mechanical brazen head, and we also see the prophecy of you will die in Jerusalem and that ironic death. Sylvester avoids Jerusalem, but he dies in the church named after Jerusalem. But here's the thing. This is often forgotten, and it was often forgotten even by people of that time, that sometimes in medieval writings, it's not necessarily meant to convey history. And I know, the chronicle is called the Chronicle of the Kings of England. It is kind of alluding that it's historical. But really here, William is not trying to defame Sylvester. Rather, he's chronicling the common folk tales of Sylvester. Even kind of saying these aren't necessarily real, but these are folk tales, and they're going to teach a moral. They're going to teach a lesson. So that is what was meant here in William of Malmesbury's work. He was trying to showcase these folk legends and their moral, not saying that this really happened. But here's the moral, right? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but I'll walk you through it. He made a pact with demons. He consulted with unknown forces. But most of all, he tried to outsmart fate, right? He said he'd never go to Jerusalem, so he dies while saying in a mass, bearing the name of Jerusalem. And there's also these rumors that his bones rattle and sweat and tears come from his tomb. And that is also kind of telling us that since he made that pact with the devil, he's found no rest in the afterlife. And all of this is because he made a deal with Satan. So, kids, don't make deals with the devil. That is what William of Malmesbury is trying to put across. So again, not necessarily meaning to be literal, but trying to convey folk tales that teach a moral. But it was read as literal by many people. But where do these legends come from? That is what I'm also very interested in, right? Because we have a lot of common legends, common themes, selling your soul, death in the Church of Jerusalem, the Brazen Head, So let's talk about each of those. And stay tuned for this because I'm also going to talk about occult grimoires and how science books kind of relate. So please keep watching. So one of the most fascinating things about the story to me is that these legends that are attributed to Sylvester have a place in history that predates at least this chronicle, if not the life of Sylvester. So you see a lot of these common tropes. The first is selling your soul, right? We see this all over the place. We see this in Christianity. We see this in other religions. We see this even today. But this is the common Faustinian myth, right? And then the death in the church bearing the name Jerusalem. It's irony. Irony is used a lot in Greek tragedy. But one other interesting thing is the origin of that his tomb will rattle, shake, or even cry or sweat before a death of a pope. So where does that come from? Because that's really interesting to me. And this comes from a misreading of the inscription on his tomb. The inscription reads in part, Ista locus Sylvestris membra sepulti venturo domino conferat ad sonitum. So it says, this place will yield to the sound of the last trumpet, the limbs of buried Sylvester II at the advent of the Lord. Basically, it's saying, at the final judgment, these bones will be reconciled with God. However, there's been a mistranslation. And essentially, it's been mistranslated as not his bones will yield to the sound, but his bones will make a sound. So people have been misreading this inscription, or at least people in the early church, as his bones are going to make a sound either at the final judgment, and over time it became his bones are going to make a sound when a pope dies. And this ties back to this restless soul who made a deal with the devil, right? He's always going to be rattling and shaking and crying out. And perhaps one of the most interesting things, though, I want to talk about is occult books, right? He allegedly stole, in the legend, he stole this occult book from his magic teacher, right? And what I find very interesting, and I've talked about this in some of my work years ago, is that some medieval science books sound a lot like magic spells. So you'll read things like, to cure a headache, you go outside during a certain hour of the night, while eating mint leaves and wearing a white crystal, and you're going to be cured. And even now, that seems a little witchcrafty, but medieval medicine, it believed that the star cycle, the moon cycle, certain herbs, certain crystals and rocks, they had numerous healing properties. And this was just medicine back then. You see this in the writings of St. Hildegard of Bingen and also St. Albert the Great. So this seems occult, but it's just how medieval people interpreted science. And to prove this, here are examples of how science books back then just seemed magical to medieval eyes, but also to us today. So you can kind of see, when I read these, how people might have thought these were spells and witchcraft. So this comes from St. Albert the Great, doctor of the church, mentor to St. Thomas Aquinas, and considered one of the most learned men of medieval Europe. So he says, certain roots must be plucked under the light of the waxing moon, others at dawn when the dew is still present. And when you pick them, you must make specific invocations to the Creator or to certain saintly intercessors. So this comes from his book on herbology, and he says when you pick certain herbs, you have to do it under a waxing moon, and you have to invoke a certain saint while doing it. So, for example, the mandrake, which is a root with many mystical associations, Albert says it should only be harvested after drawing 3 protective circles around it, with a dog tied to the root, pulling it free while the herbalist stands back, and only during specific astrological alignments. So again, if someone told you that today, you would think that they are being superstitious, or you might even say that's witchcraft. But in medieval Christianity, one of the doctors of the church, that's just science. That's just how they take care of themselves. And that's just how they believed that these herbs worked. Another example of a cure, this comes from a 12th century source. For a fever caused by unquiet spirits, Boil sage and fennel with wine, pour over a red stone, and let it sit beneath the full moon. Whisper a psalm or charm while the patient drinks. It's medicine, yes, absolutely, but there's clear ritual and symbolic resonance. This is not unlike a spell. It has materials, timing, sacred words, and intent. So one can see how people can be cautious of a Gerbert, or of Sylvester II, rather, and he has this book that says, you need to take these herbs under the full moon. They might read that like a spell, but again, to these men, and later women, we're going to talk about Hildegard next, this was just medicine. So Hildegard von Bingen is very renowned for this, and I do cover this in an episode I did on her like 2 years ago. But in her work, Physica, Hildegard writes extensively on the medicinal and mystical property of gemstones. She attributes healing power to their relationship with celestial forces. So, for instance, amethyst, she writes, should be warmed in wine and held in the mouth to soothe headaches or infections. She also says that amethyst protects against evil thoughts and drunkenness, especially when held to the chest in praying. She advises wearing amethyst against the skin, especially when the moon is waxing, to increase its healing potency. So again, here you have ancient medical texts, even from Catholic sources, and they can seem like sorcery to others. And this can bring up a whole other discussion that we're not going to have on this episode, but about what is magic, right? I feel like today what we are calling witchcraft and magic and sorcery, 5 years ago we called it New Age, 10 years ago we called it superstition. So are these things inherently against God? Calling upon a saint while you're wearing a crystal and you're, drinking some kind of herbal wine? Not inherently. You have to know what that person's intent is. And I'm not saying do this. I'm saying it's superstitious. And yes, you can become overly attached to this ritual. Or you could say or think that this herb is godlike when it's not. But this is more so in the line of old medical superstition than anything sinful, in my opinion. But anyway, we're getting off track. My point is that these things, even today, seem like spells. But back then, they were just medicine. And if people learned that their pope was going out on a full moon and drinking certain wines with certain rocks in hopes of curing something, they might get a little suspicious. But perhaps the most interesting one to me, because I didn't know how prevalent it was, is this brazen head, this bronze head. And these talking heads, they pop up more than you'd think in medieval writing, right? You don't really think of mechanics back then. And they're not very prevalent, but it's more than you think. For instance, you see them in Chaucer a decent bit, from the Canterbury Tales. For instance, in the Squire's Tale, a mechanical horse head is presented as a gift from an Arab king. And you actually did have some mechanical objects in the Middle Ages. Like I said, sometimes Gerbert is attributed to creating the first mechanical clock. But you also had mechanical water wheels and more. And the Arab world, it gave us advancements in math and astrology, and a lot of the sorcery, in quotes, of the Middle Ages was said to come from there, including these brazen heads. So here you would have people returning from studying with Islamic scholars, and they would return with mechanical clocks, with mechanical heads, or even something like an abacus. And people would say, oh, nope, that must be from the devil. You must have either used demonology to summon this bronzed head, or, which is probably more common, you used demonology to gain the knowledge to do these incredible things. A mechanical clock, that's mind-blowing. How did you learn how to do this? There's no way a human has that kind of knowledge. Therefore, you must have gotten it from the devil. So essentially what we have here is we have a more religious ancient alien theory, right? So today it's people could not have made the pyramids. It must have been aliens. Back then it was people could not have learned math like this or built mechanical clocks. It must have been demons. So you have that correlation here, and it's really present in the story of Sylvester II. However, when it comes to that brazen head, I do think it's fascinating because this is the first time where we see a brazen head used for divination. For instance, in Chaucer, it's usually a gift, or it's usually something that's scary, but here it's summoned with a demon, and there's a demon inside it, and it's helping tell the future. And that's really fascinating to me, because it seems like we kind of have this old school kind of folk tellings of the Islamic mechanical horse heads now combined with Catholic demonology. And what's also interesting is that the brazen heads did not go anywhere. Almost verbatim, this story was also attributed to Roger Bacon, who was a very brilliant astrologer, mathematician, and alchemist. He was also a Franciscan monk. And he was also said to have a brazen head who could tell the future, who would answer yes or no. And some legends say that Roger was imprisoned for this sorcery and other forms of sorcery. Though some accounts say he was punished for going against church reforms, but one of the most interesting facts for me is some historians say that he was not in prison because of sorcery or church politics, but because he was kind of a jerk. So we see the brazen head pop up yet again. So this time it would pop up with someone we already talked about, Saint Albert the Great. So Albert the Great he still is considered one of the greatest minds of the Middle Ages. Brilliant man, everything from math to science to the arts to music to everything. He was the mentor of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he was also said to have a brazen head that would answer yes or no. So this has gone down through a lineage. I would love to have a fictional retelling where this brass head is literally just regifted down through all these generations, but I'm talking about facts here. So it's said that Albert the Great also had this head, and it's said that he gifted it to St. Thomas Aquinas. And the legend kind of stops here. It's said that Aquinas either destroys the brazen head or performs an exorcism on it, and then it ends. But Aquinas was actually also subject to the sorcery claims. There were some of his contemporaries who said even Aquinas was a sorcerer. So yeah, you have all of these men and women from our faith who are often called sorcerers. The ones we talked about, Sylvester II, Albert Magnus, Roger Bacon, Thomas Aquinas. Hildegard didn't really get the same treatment because her Physica was kind of underground at the time. But you have all of these brilliant minds trying to educate the world, to bring advancements into the world, but they are cast down as evil. And that brings us to our closing segment. In the age of flickering candles and trembling faith, what we now call science once often wore the cloak of magic. A man studying the stars, building a machine, or calculating time with gears and spheres. These weren't seen as signs of genius, but they were seen as warnings, as red flags, whispers of sorcery. Pope Sylvester II, he dared to read Arabic texts, to trace the sky with an astrolabe, to believe the universe had order, and that God did not fear our understanding of it. Albert Magnus, centuries later, would dissect plants and minerals, study weather, and earn the name Doctor Universalis, only to be remembered by many as a man who built a talking android. The pattern, it seems to repeat. Where there is brilliance, there is suspicion. Where faith meets intellect, a line seems to be drawn and often misunderstood. But what if the real danger is not too much knowledge, but too little wonder? What if the real danger is too little awe, especially in light of all the created things that God has granted us? These men, they were not conjurers. They were seekers. They believed the truth, scientific or spiritual, is never something we should fear. They believe that the world is intelligible because it was created by a God of reason, not a God of chaos. They believe that we were meant to question, to explore, and even marvel, because all truth leads back to that divine source. And maybe That is the hardest magic of all. To live in a world where you can know deeply, think boldly, and still believe profoundly. Thank you, and God bless.